In February 1888, in Campbell County, Wyoming, right after the Great Die-Up disaster that left millions of cattle frozen stiff on the prairie, widow Lydia Mercer entered a period where survival and death were separated by only a single breath. Her husband had died in a blizzard night while trying to drive the herd out of the wind-scoured valley. The temperature plunged from 10 degrees Fahrenheit to below 30 degrees Fahrenheit in just a few hours, encasing branches in thick ice until a large limb snapped and killed him instantly. A week later, her 2 children died inside their own sod house from downdraft. Snow packed on the roof blocked the chimney flue, allowing CO gas to accumulate and pour down into the sleeping room, killing the children before anyone realized what was happening. It wasn't the storm that killed them first. It was the cold, merciless physics of high plains winter. The sod house held heat poorly, strong wind pressure created reverse draft, and the slightest misalignment in the chimney let death slip in like mist. From that day on, the old house became a resonating box of memory and guilt. Lydia no longer entered the kitchen where her children once sat. The smoke smell embedded in the walls forced her to turn her face away. Every night she stood before the frozen threshold, gazing toward the pitch-black sky thick with freezing wind, asking herself what any Wyoming winter survivor knows instinctively: if the shelter structure didn't change, the next winter would not let her live. In that dry, biting cold, when the ground itself contracted and cracked audibly at 20 degrees Fahrenheit, Lydia understood a simple but brutal truth. Humans do not defeat wind, do not defeat temperature. They can only prevail through the physics of the ground itself. Those thoughts became the starting point for the decision that would completely change how she faced the coming winter. In the early days of spring, 1888, while Wyoming still lay beneath the packed ice from the Great Die-Up, Lydia reopened the old storage shed where her husband had kept scattered notes on climate and how the native people survived winters. Among the dust-covered items, she found a small handwritten notebook, sketches of semi-subterranean Mandan earth lodges with thick sod roofs reinforced by wooden posts, notes on the gradually recessed stone rooms of Eastern Europe that endured centuries under snow, and a few figures of ground temperatures he had once measured with a thermometer at depths of about 1.82 meters. The soil stayed steady around 52-55 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside winds dropped to 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit. What had seemed like disconnected jottings now converged into a logic Lydia had never seen so clearly. In a blizzard, what mattered was not luxurious materials or house size, but the position of the human body relative to the ground, the pressure snow exerts on the roof, and the ability to control airflow. The log cabins in the area were easily penetrated by wind through every crack, losing heat rapidly. Sod houses withstood cold better, but their roofs collapsed easily when snow depth exceeded 3 feet. Traditional dugouts were warmer yet damp and prone to wall sloughing when soil absorbed water. None of them could withstand the increasingly erratic Wyoming winters. Lydia sat in the empty kitchen, staring at the black smoke stains still clinging to the walls from her children's gas-poisoning tragedy, and realized she could not survive another winter in such structures. She needed a space that wind could not assault, that did not rely on a wooden roof, and that used the Earth's own temperature as its foundation. The idea of a semi-subterranean chamber formed very quickly, not from inspiration, but from the necessity forced by too much loss. She sketched her first rough vision: a pit about 8 feet deep, fully below the frost line, thick stone walls about 2 hand widths wide with packed earth in between to block cold conduction, a roof of flat stone slabs corbelled inward to create a compression arch, an entrance gently curved against the valley's prevailing wind direction to minimize downdraft. But what convinced Lydia this plan could save her life was how she intended to handle heat. Instead of relying on an exposed chimney, she planned to route smoke through a 10-meter underground channel, allowing hot gases to radiate gradually into the soil before escaping far from the chamber. This would not only reduce heat loss, but also prevent strong winds from blowing back down the flue, as they had on the fateful night that killed her 2 children. Every note her husband left became a piece fitted into the survival equation. Average winter northwest winds of 25-35 miles per hour. Cold season snow loads reaching hundreds of pounds per square meter on the roof. The temperature differential between surface and subsurface sufficient to determine life or death inside. Lydia didn't need a beautiful or spacious house. She needed a physical shell aligned with the laws nature forces humans to obey. In the following nights, she spread a map of Wyoming on the table, marked the strongest wind directions, chose a gently sloping site for drainage, and redrew the chamber diagram 5 or 6 times. Each stroke of the pen seemed to pull her further from the suffocating memories of the old sod house and closer to a place that could keep her alive until spring. Her husband's notebook, once just the unfinished dream of a farmer trying to understand nature, now became the framework, allowing Lydia to create a structure capable of withstanding Wyoming's brutality. When she sat back and watched the rough sketches glow under the oil lamp, Lydia understood clearly that this was not merely a construction plan. This was the determination to turn despair into solid form, into stone, into thick layers of earth that could shelter the rest of her life. Lydia began digging at the end of March, when the surface soil of Campbell County remained rock-hard from the just-ended 20 degrees Fahrenheit winter. She stood at the bottom of a 2-foot-deep hole, but each shovel thrust bounced back into her hands like striking an iron hammer, tearing open her palms. Every evening her wrists swelled, yet the next morning Lydia descended into the pit before sunrise because she knew the frost line here reached nearly 4 feet and, to prevent winter wind backflow, she had to dig at least twice that deep. Her dog Bruno, fur stiff from the cold wind, always lay at the pit's edge, ears pricked like an antenna catching danger signals. Whenever wolf howls echoed from the Powder River direction, he would leap up, growling, reminding Lydia that in this region death came not only from temperature but also from hungry jaws. Neighbors began noticing as Lydia's hole grew deeper. At first they laughed, then they mocked. "She's planning to live underground like a gopher," one man shouted while passing in his wagon. Another chimed in, "Never seen anyone bury themselves alive and call it a house." Their laughter carried down into the pit on the wind, colder than any frost, but a few faces did not laugh. They glanced at each other, voices lowered. "What if she succeeds? Haven't we been foolish all these years?" Within the mockery was something sharper than words, the fear of being proven wrong. By mid-April, Lydia had reached nearly 6 feet. The deeper soil grew denser, each pickaxe swing dragging like iron through frozen ground. She no longer measured time in hours, but in the number of pauses needed to let her heart rate slow, to shift her body in the cramped space, and to continue. Many nights she soaked her hands in warm water to ease the stiffened finger muscles. The smell of dry earth and sweat mingled. Yet that very smell made Lydia feel she was still alive, still fighting instead of surrendering to the coming winter. Once the pit reached the required depth, Lydia began the second task, hauling stone from the river nearly 3 miles away. Slabs weighing 70-90 pounds loaded onto the old sled made her shoulders burn. The wooden levers she crafted slipped from their fulcrums many times, sending stones crashing to the ground and bruising her shins purple. Yet she returned to the river every day, using arm leverage and body weight to bring each slab home. With every stone moved, Lydia thought of the night snow compression blocked the old chimney, thought of the cold gradually draining life from her 2 children on their small bed. Compared to that pain, the pain in her legs was not worth mentioning. Early in May, an unseasonal rain lashed the valley. The 33 degrees Fahrenheit cold rain turned clay into slick slabs that slid off the surface and poured straight into the bottom of the pit where Lydia stood. In one instant, half the north wall collapsed. Lydia was buried chest-deep in earth, unable to breathe. Bruno barked frantically from above while Lydia felt the weight of soil and stone increasing every second. She clawed at the walls, kicked into the fresh sliding mud, searching for the smallest foothold to twist her body. Inches of dirt fell onto her face, but with just one tiny air gap, she could turn her shoulder upward and create space. After several desperate struggles, Lydia clawed her way onto firmer soil, head breaking through the mud, gasping like someone dragged from an icy river. When she finally stood, she looked down at the collapse section and saw more clearly what she was challenging. Not merely winter, but compression, the weight of earth, water, and human error. That accident was the first time Lydia truly felt fear. But it was also the moment she understood one thing. If she gave up, the next winter would not only defeat her as it had before, but would erase her final effort to go on living. In the weeks that followed, the attitude of those around the region began to shift. No more loud laughter on the dirt road when they passed by. A few people reined their horses longer at the pit's edge, watching Lydia reinforce the walls. Mockery turned to silence, and in that silence one thing was clear. They began to fear that Lydia might be right, a lone widow, digging a structure no one understood, yet still standing after an accident that could easily have killed her. With every stone laid, every layer of earth she tamped, a message was sent. Lydia was no longer fleeing pain. She was turning it into the force to survive. When the pit reached the size she wanted, Lydia stood at the bottom and looked up at the sky. The sky now appeared as only a narrow gray-blue window, no longer vast as it was on the surface. She found that narrowing logical. Humans can only survive by accepting the contraction that Earth and climate force upon them. And at that depth, with the faint, warm breath of soil rising against her face, Lydia knew she had stepped from the place of death onto the only path that could lead to a true spring. In early October, dry, cold winds from the Rocky Mountains began sweeping down into Campbell County, blowing wisps of grass away and exposing the soil beneath that had already lost summer's warmth. At the bottom of the pit, Lydia had dug for months. The ground remained slightly moist, enough to compact clay into a binding layer between the two walls she planned to build. Each morning, Lydia walked along the half-mile dry creek to select stone. Flat, hard limestone slabs 4 to 6 inches thick, good for compression. They were large enough to serve as the spine of the outer wall, and uniform enough for her to lock them together without much trimming. For the inner layer, she chose smaller stones, easier to angle, creating a smooth living surface later. The space between the two layers was filled with a mixture of clay, topsoil, and finely chopped dry grass, the best heat-retaining and waterproofing materials she could find in this harsh climate. As the walls rose above waist height, Lydia used a round wooden tamper to compact each layer of fill, creating a dense state that would resist lateral pressure when winter snow weighed down. In the early days, the stone walls kept collapsing. A single stone slightly off-center and entire outer sections would lean outward, forcing Lydia to tear them down and start over. She quickly learned that to stand firm, each stone had to be placed as though it carried the entire weight of winter on its shoulders. Her tools were only an iron hammer, a few wooden wedges she whittled herself, a frayed plumb line, but they were the entire engineering Lydia could rely on. The mistakes split her fingernails bloody, yet they also taught her deeper understanding of how earth and stone talk to each other. While Lydia focused on the stone walls, a young man repeatedly stood at a distance watching. Elias Boone, son of a miner who had worked Montana mine shafts. He recognized that Lydia was applying the same load distribution principles miners use to prevent shaft collapse. The way she placed stones and checked center of gravity was not mere intuition, but real knowledge of force and compression. One breezy morning, Elias came closer and asked why she chose that type of stone and why she laid it in that orientation. When he heard Lydia's brief explanation about prevailing winter wind direction, gravity, and compressive strength, Elias remained silent for a moment, as though he could not believe a widow understood things the men of the region only vaguely grasped. But not everyone greeted her earnest curiosity with silence. One afternoon, Caleb Warren appeared, face red from cold and irritation. He planted a foot on the pit's edge, looked down at the work, then laughed out loud. "A tomb house? Planning to bury yourself early, are you?" He kicked a stone. Lydia had just set in place, sending it tumbling to the bottom. Bruno growled, but Caleb only smirked and walked away. Lydia said nothing, simply bent down, picked up the stone, and replaced it as though nothing had happened. That very silence angered Caleb more than any retort could. A few days later, Elias returned to help Lydia adjust some large slabs, while others stood farther back, no longer mocking, yet not daring to approach. The structure began taking shape, revealing Lydia's intention. This was not a pit of despair, but a calculated construction designed to resist the full compressive force of a Wyoming winter. When the first complete wall reached shoulder height, Lydia stepped back and placed her calloused hand on the cold stone. The surface was rough, yet behind it lay hundreds of pounds of compressive force it could withstand if she placed it correctly. In that moment, for the first time since the night she lost her husband and children, Lydia felt she could defeat winter not through strength, but through understanding the way earth and stone truly operate. When the stone walls reached the required height, Lydia entered the most difficult phase of the entire project, raising the corbelled stone roof, where the smallest error could bury her alive under hundreds of pounds of rock. Her husband's notes on 3 types of corbel roofs became the starting point for the nights Lydia sat before the oil lamp, reading and visualizing the snow-loading pressure of Wyoming blizzards sweeping through the valley. A single corbel ring was easy, but would fail under 3-4 feet of snow. A tapering tower was stronger yet required more stone than she could haul. Only the double corbel ring would work. Each course recessed 2 inches, center of gravity always resting on the stone below, distributing the entire snow load in an arch. It all sounded simple on paper, but to execute it, Lydia had to place each stone slab as though she were placing her own life. She used a homemade measuring stick to check the recession of every course. More than half an inch off, and the entire structure would lose balance. Those October mornings, the dry wind screamed across the pit mouth, stones so cold they clung to her skin as though trying to steal the last warmth from her body. Lydia struggled to lift an 80-pound slab into trial position. As she twisted her shoulder to set it, her hand slipped on the dry stone dust mixed with sweat. The slab fell inches from her temple. The impact sent a dry crack echoing down the pit. She stood motionless for seconds, heart pounding like a hammer, then understood very clearly. One mistake, and she would truly be buried alive here. But that was only the first warning. A few nights later, winds from the mountains rushed down so fiercely the ground trembled slightly. Lydia was sleeping when Bruno clawed frantically at the door, growling low. She grabbed the lamp, ran to the pit, and saw small clumps of earth falling around the rim. When she descended to check, she heard a faint crack from the inner ring of the roof. One breath later, a quarter of the inner course collapsed, stones sliding in a twisting fall, striking Lydia's leg and pinning her to the floor. She tried to turn, but the weight of the slabs made her leg burn with pain so intense she nearly fainted. Bruno howled long and loud, and that sustained howl was what brought Elias Boone running through the night. Elias jumped into the pit the moment he saw Lydia trapped, cold sweat on his forehead despite the cutting wind. He pried each slab with a crowbar, little by little, knowing one wrong move would bring more collapse. Those seconds stretched like an entire winter until Lydia pulled her leg free from the stone gap and collapsed onto the chamber floor. They sat in silence in the darkness for a while, hearing only ragged breathing and the wind whipping across the pit mouth, reminding them that death in Wyoming does not need snow to claim its victims. That accident was the first time Lydia wanted to give up. The pain in her leg was less terrifying than the realization that she was challenging a force hundreds of times greater than herself: gravity, wind, and winter. But when she sat again, opened her husband's notebook, Lydia saw the line he had once written: "The earth never betrays anyone who knows how to speak with it." She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, then returned to the work the next morning, not because she felt no fear, but because fear would not protect her from the coming winter either. And so Lydia began the second roof. Each course recessed exactly 2 inches, each stone tested for balance 3 times before she released it. Elias came back to help in the final days, saying little, only watching Lydia's movements like a guardian of life. On November 11, the final stone ring closed, forming a complete vault. Lydia lay on her back directly beneath the roof, watching the stone courses converge like a stone flower closing above her head. She felt not that the stone was standing firm, but that she herself was standing firm. In that moment, for the first time in years, Lydia did not think of death. She thought of winter as an opponent that could be overcome with mind and endurance, not mere luck. The sealed roof was not merely the end of construction. It was the beginning of rebirth. Lydia spent many consecutive days perfecting the earthen roof layer, the final step that determined the entire structure's ability to ensure survival. She used an old wooden barrel attached to a homemade pulley to haul load after load of soil up onto the stone roof, gradually building a layer 24-30 inches thick enough to prevent winter penetration and heavy enough to distribute pressure evenly across the whole construction. As the earthen mound began to swell into a natural rise, blending into the prairie with exactly the kind of gentle curve that wind usually sculpts, Lydia's work almost disappeared from a stranger's eye. From a distance, it looked no different than a patch of ground trampled firm by cattle. After the roof, Lydia built an L-shaped entrance. This was where she invested the most thought, because if the entry remained open, all the retained heat would vanish in a single windy night. She constructed 2 doors, an outer door thick and sturdy against wind and snow, and an inner door lighter to preserve warmth. These two layers created a simple but effective airlock that reduced heat loss by nearly 70%. Lydia oriented the entrance toward the southeast, avoiding the straight rush of northern winds. When strong gusts swept through the valley, she stood and watched the airflow whip past the tunnel mouth without being able to pull heat out, a first very good sign. The next step was testing the underground smoke channel. She lit a small fire with a handful of wick and scraps of kindling, then observed the smoke crawl slowly through the roughly 10-meter passage she had dug and reinforced with hardened clay. The smoke passed through the moist soil, gradually warming it, before escaping through a vent several dozen paces away. No backdraft occurred, no dangerous buildup of heat. This was the heating system Lydia staked her life on. Heat had to transfer into the walls first, not escape into the air. Once the structure was secure, Lydia took her husband's old mercury thermometer, the one he had used to monitor temperatures while ranching. She placed it inside the chamber, extinguished the fire, waited several hours, then checked. Outside, it was only 17 degrees Fahrenheit, with face-cutting wind. Inside, it read 54 degrees Fahrenheit without any fire burning at all. When she exhaled gently, the air still felt warm on her fingertips. This was the first time in her life Lydia witnessed a place stand firm against winter instead of surrendering to it. She wept, not from old pain, but because finally there was something in the world that did not try to kill her. The news spread faster than she expected. Neighbors who once stood at a distance to mock now lingered longer, their gazes no longer scornful but searching. Some peered through the door crack and saw gentle warmth rising like the breath of the earth. They said nothing, but Lydia knew that silence was no longer contempt. It was fear mixed with curiosity. If this structure truly held heat, then what did all the houses they had built over the years mean in the face of the next winter? Caleb Warren stood farther back than anyone. When he saw the warmth drifting from the airlock, his face momentarily paled. He had once called Lydia's work a living tomb. Now it looked nothing like a grave. It looked like a fortress against the cold. Panic mingled with envy flashed clearly in his eyes, and Lydia understood that winter did not only change the land, it also exposed the cracks in human hearts. Lydia moved into the chamber on a cold, dry November afternoon, when the sun had just passed the low ridge and wind began whipping long strips across the prairie face. Inside, the space was small but orderly, a packed earth bed covered with a thick layer of tamped straw to prevent moisture absorption. Several stone shelves carved directly into the walls, enough to hold dried food and the few remaining possessions. An oil lamp hung from an iron hook she had forged herself from an old nail scavenged behind the horse shed. Everything was rough and minimal, yet exactly what was needed for survival. No excess, nothing essential missing. On the first night, Lydia blew out the small stove fire and listened. Up above, the wind screamed so fiercely it sounded as if the entire sky was being torn apart. But only a few steps below ground level, the cold was completely blocked. No draft slipped through the door cracks. No chill ran down her spine as it had in the old sod houses. The temperature remained improbably warm for late fall in Wyoming. The earth held the warmth as though it were breathing alongside her. When Lydia lay down on the bed, the straw rustled softly, a small sound, yet enough for her to realize how exhausted her body had become after months of living on sheer will. For the first time since the deaths of her husband and 2 children, her eyelids closed without panic rushing in, without visions of the sod roof collapsing, without the sound of her son coughing in the middle of a blizzard night. She heard only her own steady breathing in the enclosed space, regular as the pulse of the earth. Sleep came quickly and deeply, so deeply that when she awoke, Lydia took several seconds to realize she was no longer in the old house, no longer living amid memories that squeezed the life out of her with cold. She was in a place she had built with her own hands, a place that bore no trace of death. In the lamplight, Lydia took from her pocket the small handkerchief of her daughter, the one she still carried like an anchor to the life that had been lost. She did not place it on the bed as she had always done before. Instead, she set it on the stone shelf beside the gently burning oil lamp. The flame reflected off the edge of the cloth, making it glow like a final breath of the day. That small gesture carried greater meaning than words. She did not deny the pain, but placed it in a safe place, a place that no longer threatened her. The chamber was not merely warm. It was peaceful, in a way difficult to describe. The earth embraced her, gently yet firmly, as though this place was not meant for fleeing the cold, but for allowing her to begin again without stepping out of the storm-torn region of memory. In that stillness, Lydia understood that she had not yet been reborn, but she had at last stopped the long fall that had continued for the past year. And sometimes, simply stopping is itself a victory over winter. When January slid into Wyoming like a cold blade, Lydia sensed the change in the air even before the sky shifted color. That night, the barometer in her pocket dropped sharply, a signal anyone who had lived long on this land understood. An Arctic front was surging down the north-south axis. The dense, heavy Canadian air mass rushed across the Great Plains, creating extreme pressure differentials strong enough to generate 70-80 miles per hour winds scouring the ground. Snow did not fall in flakes, but in tiny, dry pellets like summer riverbed sand, driven horizontally by the wind into stinging white bands that forced their way into every crack, no matter how small. Temperatures plunged from 5 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 10 hours. In the small settlements along the Bighorn Basin Valley, people bolted doors, piled wood, drew blankets, but all knew these were merely rituals of reassurance, not defenses against the death creeping along the ground. The Andrews family sod house was the first to fall. When the wind shifted from west to north, the sod roof froze into a solid mass. When that mass cracked, wind pressure punched through 4 thick layers of turf, cold flooding in like a blade. The red-hot stove instantly turned gray. Fire sucked backward up the chimney as if strangled. The youngest child, little Anna, lay convulsing from the cold despite being wrapped in 3 blankets. In the Foster family's log cabin, wind blew so hard the rafters vibrated. Dry pine could not withstand such rapid temperature swings. The grain snapped with sharp pops and split. When wind poured through those cracks, cold shot straight into the bedroom, forcing Mrs. Foster to sit up all night tending the fire, hands trembling because the flames were not enough. Everyone knew that if the wind held 80 miles per hour for hours, half the houses in the region would not survive the night. But the real catastrophe struck at Caleb Warren's ranch. Snow accumulated on the roof in just 3 hours, exceeding 3 feet. The rafters, already weakened by summer rot, could not bear the compressive load. When an 88 miles per hour gust hit the roof corner squarely, the entire snow mass collapsed with thousands of pounds of force. The roof caved in, crashing onto the bed where Caleb's wife sat watching their 2 children. Mrs. Warren was knocked unconscious instantly. Caleb tried to drag her from the wreckage, but the wind was so fierce that every time he opened the door, the house felt as if it would lift off its foundation. In desperation, he looked south toward where Lydia lived, the place he had once mocked, once said she was digging her own grave. Now he ran toward that grave, because outside temperatures had reached 52 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to kill in minutes without wind, and with this wind, exposed skin froze solid in seconds. Caleb carried his wife on his back, guided the 2 children, stepping into a thick white curtain that reduced visibility to less than 2 feet. The wind blew sideways, forcing their bodies to lean, each step a battle against both gravity and gale. They could not see the direction to Lydia's place. Only Elias Boone, on his way to check the cattle pens, rushed to help when he heard Bruno barking from afar. Elias hoisted Mrs. Warren onto his back. Caleb guided the children. The group followed the dog's sustained howl, because in a storm like this, compasses were useless. Trees vanished entirely, and only animals could sense direction at close range. The wind was so strong that every shout they uttered was sucked away after a single meter. Elias tied Caleb to himself with rope, then tied the children behind. They moved like a blind chain, guided only by Bruno's scattered barks. And then, through the powder-thick snow, the faint glow of an oil lamp appeared behind the earth, the L-shaped entrance of Lydia's chamber. When the door opened, a 55 degrees Fahrenheit wave of warm air exhaled like the breath of the earth. Lydia pulled the group inside, closed the outer door, then the inner, locking the wind out. In the golden light, the warm earth vapor immediately brought color back to Mrs. Warren's ghostly white cheeks. The 2 children were wrapped in blankets and given warm water Lydia had heated in a tin can. Caleb knelt on the floor, face buried in his hands, trembling both from cold and from shame. Lydia said nothing, only continued pouring hot water into wooden bowls and handing them to each person. But before they could fully warm, a heavy thud sounded from the entrance. The storm had packed half the L-shaped passage with compressed snow. If completely sealed, the chamber would run out of oxygen in hours. Lydia grabbed a shovel and dug from inside, but each scoop sent snow pouring back into the room. Everyone took turns shoveling snow out of the floor. Every time the door opened, wind sucked away the newly accumulated warmth. Elias held the door. Caleb shoveled. Lydia stacked snow behind, and the children gathered small clumps and returned them to the old water basket. Outside, the storm seemed intent on crushing every attempt at survival. Each gust generated pressure strong enough to force air through the tiniest cracks. While shoveling, Lydia grew dizzy from the wind, pulling oxygen outward. Elias pulled her back, gave her a sip of warm water, but when they opened the door again, the snow had risen nearly to the top of the entrance. One small mistake would seal the entire passage. Lydia decided to dig at a diagonal upward instead of straight, reducing the risk of total collapse of the L path. In 20 minutes of tension that felt like time bent, they finally punched through a small ventilation hole. Wind howled into the vent, but no longer forced strongly into the room. The chamber was safe to breathe in, at least until the storm passed. When they closed the door for the last time, Lydia placed her hand on the earthen wall, feeling the warmth holding steady at 50-55 degrees Fahrenheit. The structure she built herself had withstood what dozens of houses in the region could not. But what made her shiver was not the victory of physics, but the reality that the people who once despised her were now alive because of that very chamber's warmth. And the storm had not yet ended. 6 people crowded into a chamber barely wider than 2 outstretched arms, with not enough food for comfort, not enough room to stretch legs, yet possessing the most important thing: warmth. Temperature held steady, around 54-56 degrees Fahrenheit, enough so breath did not turn to frost, enough so children's hands stayed pink. Lydia divided the hard bread, dried meat, and beans she had dried in the fall, portioned with the careful calculation of someone who understood a storm could last longer than any prediction. The room glowed dimly under one oil lamp, its light dancing with each gust that howled outside the L passage, as if reminding everyone that death still waited patiently beyond. The confined space, the forced closeness, and the first 2 days passed in awkward silence. On the second night, as the wind outside continued its long clawing howls across the ground, Caleb Warren could bear it no longer. He set his piece of bread down, took a deep breath, and spoke in a voice hoarse from both shame and exhaustion. "I didn't mock you because I thought you were crazy. I mocked you because I was afraid. Afraid that if you were right, the whole region would see how foolish we've been." The words fell like a stone. No one answered immediately. Caleb stared at his cracked hands, voice dropping lower. "I was afraid of change. Afraid of what I didn't understand. Afraid that everything I've done for years was wrong." Lydia said nothing. She was looking into the lamp flame, where the light fell on Caleb's face, revealing the collapse of a man who once thought himself invincible against winter. Elias Boone broke the silence. "No one is foolish for learning something new, only foolish for refusing to learn. Caleb, everyone in this region has been wrong at some point." His tone held no accusation, only the calm of someone discussing weather. The 2 children huddled behind their father, eyes wide, watching between the 2 men. Tension eased slowly, like cold withdrawing from the chamber each time Lydia added fuel. On the 3rd night, as the wind outside began changing rhythm, Lydia sat beside Mrs. Warren, who was still weak from the roof collapse. Then, for the first time since her own tragedy, Lydia told the story of her 2 children's deaths. No sound interrupted. The small chamber became a quiet sanctuary. Lydia spoke in a low, steady voice, neither trembling nor slow, simply even as though recounting something she had turned over in her mind countless times throughout the year. The cold pouring down the sod roof, the chimney blocked by packed snow, poison gas backing into the house, the 2 children coughing until their lips turned blue, her husband trying to break a vent hole, her trying to keep the fire alive, but nature did not care about human effort. They died in her arms. She told it not to seek pity. It was simply the first time she allowed the pain to leave her body. When Lydia fell silent, no one moved. The oil lamp crackled, as though answering for them. Then one of Caleb's children, little Ruthie, reached out and lightly touched Lydia's wrist, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible, yet enough for Lydia to feel the child's warmth like a ray of light piercing cold earth. The next day, Lydia took the small handkerchief of her daughter, the object she always kept like a piece of the child's soul, and gave it to little Ruthie. "Keep it, so even the cold will know how to have mercy." The words were soft, yet they shook the entire chamber in silent emotion. Caleb bowed his head very low. "Missus," Warren began to cry. Tears held back like steam trapped in earth, finally finding release. From that day, time was no longer measured by the howling wind outside, but by small moments within. Elias, teaching the children minor-style riddles about gravity and stone. Caleb telling stories of his youth, lost in pine forests, and finding his way home by the North Star. Lydia recounting how her husband once believed wind carried memories away, so whenever he missed someone, he stood at the door and let the wind take the longing to make it lighter. They laughed many times, not because the stories were funny, but because laughter was the only thing proving they were still alive amid a winter that was killing half of Wyoming. The children began playing small games in the chamber, making hand shadow rabbits and birds on the stone wall, competing to count the most condensation drops on the wall. Laughter burst out like fragments of light, reflecting on Lydia's face and making her pause. She had thought she would never hear that sound again, the sound of life. Each night, as the wind gradually thinned, Lydia realized something strange. These trap days did not feel like moments of fear, but like a kind of soul survival. This was no longer merely a shelter. It had become a place where 6 people, once strangers or even hostile, were relearning how to trust one another in a land where winter had only ever taught suspicion. The winter outside had not yet stopped. But inside, Lydia felt something changing, not only in the earthen walls that held warmth, but in the very people sitting around the small lamp. This was the first time she thought, perhaps this chamber was not only saving their lives, but also repairing the broken parts in each of them. When the wind finally retreated from the Bighorn Basin Valley in early March, the scene spring revealed left many people standing in stunned silence. 14 cattle sheds completely shattered, sod roofs sagging down like rotten skin peeled from bone frames. 5 people frozen to death inside their own homes. 3 other families losing nearly all their children to pneumonia from overnight drafts. More than 300 cattle, horses, and sheep lay scattered across the prairie, bodies frozen solid mid-flight, as though time had halted them in place. The log cabins once proudly called thick and sturdy now gaped with large holes, as if clawed open by iron talons. Melting snow left the ground pocked and uneven like a map of disaster. Amid that devastation, Lydia Mercer's chamber was found in a state no one could believe. 100% intact, no leaks along the roof line, no cracks in the walls, no collapses anywhere. When people stepped inside, many froze because the floor remained dry, the walls still warm, and the 24-30-inch earthen roof unbroken despite weeks of compressed snow load. Word spread so quickly that within days the Fremont County authorities sent men to survey. 2 local engineers measured wall thickness with steel tape and tapped each stone section with a wooden mallet. They looked at each other, took notes, then repeated the measurements as though unable to trust the results. One whispered, half in awe and half in respect, "The uniformity of this wall deviates by less than half an inch. For one person to achieve that precision, it's not chance." The report they submitted to the county contained a single line that stirred the entire region. Mercer Shelter, the warmest structure in the valley. People came to see not out of curiosity, but because they were seeking an answer to why their homes failed while Lydia survived. They stood quietly in the dim light inside the chamber, touched the still warm earthen walls, then looked at Lydia, no longer with the mocking eyes of the previous autumn. The first to speak was Caleb Warren. He stepped forward to face Lydia amid the crowd, bowing so deeply his face nearly touched the ground. "I was wrong," he said, voice hoarse, with both shame and gratitude. "I laughed at what I did not understand, and that almost killed my whole family." The air grew so still that the drip of melting ice from the roof outside could be heard clearly. Lydia nodded slowly. She spoke no words of blame. The blizzard had already spoken for her. When Caleb rose, others stepped forward to ask Lydia to teach them how to build such chambers. They did not ask for free labor. They asked to learn, and that was the greatest change winter brought. Lydia agreed to teach, asking nothing in return except the promise that whoever learned would pass it on to others. Throughout March and April, an unprecedented movement took place in the valley. Men who once sneered that Lydia was digging a grave now lined up to practice laying stone according to the center of gravity principles she taught. Women mixed clay and topsoil in the ratios Lydia had developed after hundreds of hours of trial. Children ran after Bruno as the dog guarded the entrance, like the sentinel of the entire movement. By the end of May, 12 new chambers had been built following Lydia's design, each slightly adjusted according to the geology of its site. From being seen as symbols of poverty or despair, underground homes began to be spoken of in the community as winter houses, life-keeping houses, even the way intelligent people work with the earth. A local blacksmith said that this winter had finally broken the ore, a long-standing pillar of Wyoming pride. They were used to fighting nature. But Lydia showed them the only way to win was to work with it. By late spring, as new grass covered the fresh mounds, the valley had transformed its building culture. And the person who led that change was not an engineer, not a politician, but a widow once mocked by the entire region, the woman who dared to bring her mind and heart beneath the earth before anyone else. Lydia Mercer lived until 1921, nearly 3 decades after the 50 degrees Fahrenheit storm that changed the course of both her life and the entire Bighorn Basin Valley. When age made her legs no longer strong enough to dig as in her youth, Lydia moved into a small wooden house her adopted son built directly over the mound where the shelter lay below. In the mornings, she sat on the porch, watching wind move across the prairie without the old sense of threat. In the evenings, she placed her hand on the doorframe, feeling the warmth rising from the earth beneath the warmth that had once kept her and so many others from death. Every winter, Lydia's chamber became a refuge for the whole area. When word came of blizzards approaching from the Absaroka Range, people led one another down into the shelter, gathered around the oil lamp, retold old stories to the children, and each time they mentioned the fateful winter of 1888 as a lesson beyond any book, a lesson about placing trust in the mind when nature tests the limits of human endurance. When Lydia passed away, her descendants erected a stone marker made from the very same flat limestone she had used to build the chamber walls. On it was carved a line the whole valley came to regard as truth. Lydia Mercer. She built where the wind could not reach. And because she did, we learned to live again. Children in the region grew up with the story of the woman who dared build a house under the ground when the whole region feared it, like a legend that needed no myth. Local teachers told of her at the beginning of every winter, as a reminder that wisdom does not always come from the majority. And courage sometimes takes the form of a woman bending beneath the earth, laying each stone true to center of gravity. By the early 20th century, tourists from neighboring states began to arrive, standing in that small yet strangely warm space, touching the cool stone walls and asking the locals, did she really build all of this alone? The people of the region only smiled, because anyone who had lived through Wyoming winters knew the answer was not in the number of hands, but in the strength of a single will. Lydia's chamber still stands, still maintains a steady 52-55 degrees Fahrenheit, as on the first day, still quietly resisting every great wind season. And her story remains the same, resting in the memory of the earth, in the sound of wind whistling across the prairie, in the footsteps of children running around the mound each returning spring, because in the end, as people still whisper when leaving the chamber, it is not the stone roof that keeps people alive. It is the courage that placed the first stone. If you love stories of survival and the wisdom of the past, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys. Thank you for joining me. See you in the next video.